In February of 2019, we profiled the case of Mary Jane Vangilder, a 34-year-old mother of 5 and Fairmont, West Virginia native who disappeared from northern Ohio in 1945. Despite constant and vigorous searches, including a personal correspondence with FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, few clues to her disappearance could be found. To say that she disappeared is actually something of a tremendous understatement. In truth, Mary Jane Vangilder appeared to have abruptly vanished without so much as a trace. However, it now appears that the solid facade of this 75-year-old mystery may finally have been pierced. Since our original feature premiered, there have been a number of new developments in this perplexing case. Officer Adam Turner with the Shelby, Ohio Police Department has been pursuing leads on behalf of Mary Jane's family for well over a year now. He has thus far succeeded in identifying and excluding more than a handful of Jane Does and targeting several others for further investigation. Recently, Turner's persistence paid a huge dividend with the discovery of a large cache of official documents once thought long ago destroyed. This documentation, recently acquired by Officer Turner, is being presented here for the first time. At the conclusion of our original feature on Mary Jane Vangilder, we cited 3 Jane Does identified by Officer Turner as potential matches to Mary Jane. One Jane Doe was found in Oregon in 1946, another in Pinellas County, Florida in 1961, and the other in Preble County, Ohio in 1968. At the time our feature was posted, work was underway to have the remains of the Preble County Jane Doe exhumed in order to extract DNA for comparison. Mysterious WV was graciously invited to attend this momentous event, which commenced on the morning of August 28, 2019. In addition to Officer Turner, representatives of the Preble County Coroner's Office, as well as Shelby, Ohio Chief of Police Lance Combs, were on hand as ground was broken. Weeks of poring over burial records and photographs paid off as the Jane Doe's vault was located on the very first attempt. The rounded cover of the decades-old container was gradually brought into view for the first time in 51 years. The vault was found to be in remarkably good condition, so much so that the heavy lid was lifted from the ground by its original handles. Once the lid was removed, representatives of the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation arrived to conduct the formal disinterment. In a scene that was evocative of an archaeological excavation, the contents of the vault were carefully examined, sorted, and removed for closer examination. The excavation was punctuated by one major disappointment. Despite the remarkable state of preservation, it was quickly ascertained that neither the skull nor the mandible of the Jane Doe were present. It was hypothesized that they had most likely been donated to a public school in the area, apparently a common practice with unidentified skeletal remains. The remaining bones were sorted on site and later sent away to see if a viable DNA sample could be obtained. As of this feature, all efforts have been unsuccessful. Undeterred by this setback, Officer Turner continued his investigation. In February of 2020, Turner was preparing to appear as a guest on The Vanished, an internet podcast hosted by Amanda Coleman. During preparations, Mary Jane's employment at the Shelby Army Air Force Depot was discussed, as was the prevailing theory concerning any documentation of her work there. During our feature, we noted that the existence of one lone document from the United States Army concerning Mary Jane's employment was something of a minor miracle. The vast majority of World War II-era service records were destroyed in a disastrous fire in 1973 at the National Archives in St. Louis. This infamous event is thought to have robbed historians and genealogists alike of most U.S. Army records between 1912 and 1973. However, recent articles concerning the disposition of the archive's holdings have challenged this nearly 50-year-old supposition. Researchers have made it known that not all of the records held in St. Louis at the time were damaged, and many which were damaged were not destroyed. This nationally distributed photo shows one file pulled from the ashes. While charred and waterlogged, it is obviously not completely destroyed, and could potentially still yield its contents under the proper conditions. Turner was soon contacted by military historian Lisa Foster. Foster, an expert in World War II documents, directed Turner to a National Archives website posting from 2013. This posting made reference to military and civilian personnel records. Further reading revealed an incredible and little-known fact. While roughly 75% of the military records maintained by the archives were affected in some way by the 1973 fire, the records of non-enlisted or civilian personnel had been stored at another location and were available to researchers. Officer Turner contacted David Hardin at the National Archives in St. Louis and requested a search for any records pertaining to Mary Jane Vangilder. Shortly thereafter, Hardin replied with incredible news. Mary Jane's personnel file, a potential goldmine of official and personal information, had been located. Almost as if time were reluctant to give up its secrets, the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic delayed the delivery of Mary Jane's file until August 5th. That same day, Officer Turner contacted Mysterious WV with the news. Finally, at long last, a breakthrough. Prior to August 5, 2020, the number of official documents pertaining to Mary Jane's life prior to her disappearance could be counted on two hands. Counting birth, marriage, and census records, the figure now stands at 90 plus. The personnel file, once thought lost to flames, has opened up a far wider and much more detailed window into Mary Jane's life, both prior to and during her time here in Ohio. Based upon this newly discovered information, we are now able to present the following updated account of Mary Jane's last known year of existence. Mary Jane Vangilder's personnel record, officially her 201 file, begins on March 4, 1944, with this letter from the local Civil Service Board at the 831st Army Air Force Specialized Depot in Shelby, Ohio. This document indicates that Mary Jane was applying for employment at the depot as a storekeeper, designation CAF-1, a non-essential employee. On subsequent pages of her application, Mary Jane repeatedly lists her current address as 311 Woodland Avenue in Willard, Ohio, an address which had been previously identified, but was originally thought to have been Mary Jane's last known address in Ohio. This supposition was based partly on the fact that the last known record of Mary Jane's existence, the final publication of her divorce notice, was published in the Willard Times on April 4, 1946. Also, this address was listed by the FBI in letters written to Mary Jane's daughter as her last address. 311 Woodland Avenue in Willard, Ohio, is located here, south of the CSX Railway. Just what, if any, significance the address or location may have held for Mary Jane, or just how she came to live there, is unknown. In 1944, 311 Woodland Avenue sat across the street from the YMCA building and a playground. A newer residence, constructed around 1965, now stands in its location. Mary Jane was applying for employment at what was locally referred to as the Shelby Army Air Force Depot, a large aircraft supply facility located just north of Shelby, Ohio. The Air Force Depot was located here, roughly 20 miles south of Willard, Ohio. Many of the buildings which comprise the depot still stand and remain in use. Before she could begin her employment, Mary Jane had to undergo a medical examination. Shown here for the first time, this examination provides an intimate and detailed picture of Mary Jane's physical and personal disposition. She stood 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed 165 pounds. Her hair and eyes were brown. Her eyesight was 20/30, and she was able to hear clearly at a distance of at least 20 feet. She apparently had decayed or damaged teeth, no history of venereal disease, and her blood pressure was listed as 120/60. Her brief medical history shows that she contracted whooping cough in 1921 and chickenpox in 1922. On her personal questionnaire, Mary Jane stated that she had acquired an 8th grade education and was in good physical condition. Curiously, on the second page of the questionnaire, Mary Jane lists her dependents as only 1 child, when she in fact had 5. Perhaps the most revealing information from the application section of Mary Jane's file comes from her security questionnaire. Here, Mary Jane not only repeated and confirmed her address and vital statistics, but was required to list family members, previous addresses, previous employments, and personal references. Concerning her previous employment, Mary Jane gave the following information. From February until April of 1942, employed as a waitress and clerk by M.H. Mays of Route 3 in Fairmont, West Virginia. The name Meadowdale is written under the employer's name. From August of 1943 until February of 1944, employed as a waitress and clerk by James Betts at 401 Adams Street in Fairmont. On a separate page, James Betts is also listed as manager of the Sports Center at the same address. Mary Jane stated that from 1935 until 1942, she was a housewife. 401 Adams Street is located here, at the corner of Adams and Madison Streets in downtown Fairmont. Today, the location is a parking lot adjacent to a parking garage and across the street from Workforce, West Virginia. This site is situated on the same block as the former Fairmont Theater at 416 Adams Street, where Mary Jane is said to have lived prior to moving to Ohio. The theater burned down in February of 1945. As personal references, Mary Jane listed the following individuals. 1. Tom Ford, a retired railroad employee living at the Madison Hotel in Fairmont. 2. A. Page King, a teacher also living in Fairmont. 3. Fred Haskins, a laborer living at 401 and a half Adams Street in Fairmont. 4. Joe Doringer, a tax collector in Fairmont. Her second employer, James Betts, is also listed as a reference. In the section concerning her family, Mary Jane again listed only her eldest daughter, Anna May, as a child. Also of interest is the listing for Mary Jane's sister, Rose or Rosie. Rose also went missing sometime prior to 1963, and previously her only known married name was Leeson. Rose married Harold Leeson on July 7, 1934. According to the 1940 census, they were still married and had 2 children. Here, Rosie's last name is listed as Ashcraft. Just who Mr. Ashcraft was is currently unknown. According to her file, Mary Jane Vangilder commenced her employment as a storekeeper at the Shelby Depot on March 7, 1944. On May 31st, she was promoted from storekeeper to junior warehouseman. On December 21st, she received an award of emblem for her civilian services. Just what precipitated Mary Jane's departure from the Shelby Depot is now somewhat uncertain. On either February 17th or February 21st of 1945, she apparently made a request to be transferred and reassigned to the labor and equipment pool as a high lift and fork operator. The written description for this position appears to confirm that Mary Jane was either licensed or at least capable of driving an automobile. However, Mary Jane never did work as a high lift and fork operator. On March 8, 1945, she requested immediate release from her employment. Multiple documents in her file state the reason given for this request as added household duties, although no clarification is given. Mary Jane's formal request for personnel action states that she did give 15 days' notice before requesting her release. Handwritten on the back of her signed request is the address Box 154, Willard, Ohio. Following her first job review on September 30th, 1944, Mary Jane's address is listed as Number 2 Truck Street, Plymouth, Ohio. This individual earning form for the second half of 1944 shows Mary Jane's former address in Willard, Ohio, crossed out and replaced in 2 places by the Number 2 Truck Street address. Plymouth, Ohio is located roughly 7 miles south of Willard along the Huron-Richland County line. In 1945, Number 2 Truck Street was located here on the Richland County side. Today, the numerical designation of this location is 26 Truck Street. Curiously, nowhere in the entire personnel file is there any reference to Mary Jane's third supposed address during her time in Ohio. Correspondence from the early 1950s lists another address for Mary Jane as number 19 Sandusky Street, Plymouth, Ohio, which is located here, roughly 100 yards north of the Truck Street address, but on the Huron County side of the county line. The residence which once occupied this site is no longer standing. Contemporary maps show it to be a combination 1- and 2-story frame structure located between the Plymouth, Ohio Police Department and the town jail. Sadly, the detailed personnel file makes no reference to Mary Jane's future plans or subsequent addresses. Her signature on this document from March 7, 1945, is the last time that her existence can be confirmed with 100% certainty. Although the personnel file shed no additional light on Mary Jane's post-war activities, it has provided investigators with perhaps the most crucial of all personal identification, a piece of information which, until now, has proved elusive: a Social Security number. Under normal circumstances, we would not release the Social Security number of a missing person. However, as the likelihood of Mary Jane being alive today is infinitesimal, and inasmuch as it represents the best possible lead to date, we are making Mary Jane Vangilder's Social Security number available in the hopes that it may, somewhere and in some way, trigger a hit of some kind. If Mary Jane subsequently remarried or started a new life in another location, this number may enable her movements to be plotted. Mary Jane Vangilder's Social Security number was 234-32-0125. It would have been issued in West Virginia sometime after 1936 and before 1950. Officer Adam Turner is currently pursuing legal means to confirm any activity on this number after March 7, 1945. Should these inquiries lead to any further developments, we will report on them in a future video. Along with the personnel file, 2 additional Jane Does who share similarities with Mary Jane have also been identified. DNA comparison is already underway on one of them. The other, a Jane Doe found in Cleveland, Ohio in 1969, is also to be exhumed for the same purpose. The first of these Jane Does was discovered in Montreal, Quebec in 2001. They were found near a car park adjacent to the Allen Memorial Institute, a psychiatric hospital associated with the Royal Victoria Hospital and McGill University. The remains were completely skeletonized. There were no signs of violence, and an exact cause of death could not be determined. Authorities were able to determine that the remains had been in the area where they were found for approximately 1 year. The Jane Doe was clad in gray clothing, identified as the type of attire worn by both patients and hospital staff. However, all patients and staff members from the previous few years were later accounted for. Authorities estimated that this Jane Doe was between 50 and 70 years of age when she died. She stood approximately 5 feet 3 to 5 feet 7 inches tall and had dark, curly hair with sections of gray. It was also discovered that she may have sustained an injury to her shoulder or spine at some earlier point in her life. This Jane Doe later became the inspiration for Madame Victoria by famed French-Canadian author Catherine Leroux. The second Jane Doe now under consideration was found in Lake Erie on November 14, 1969, by members of the Cleveland Water Department. This Jane Doe was estimated to have been between 35 and 45 years of age. She stood approximately 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighed approximately 201 pounds. She had short, dark hair and brown eyes and was clad in an aqua-colored dress and a white, full-length girdle. A pair of black or dark brown loafers were found on her feet. She had a gold wristwatch secured to her left wrist, a ring on her left-hand ring finger, and was also noted to have been wearing a necklace. At the time of this feature, the final legal arrangements are being made to allow this Jane Doe to be exhumed for DNA extraction. And once again, Mysterious WV has graciously been invited to attend the exhumation. Thus far, no exact date has been set. If nothing else, these latest developments in a case that has now spanned 75 years should serve as ample proof that giving up should not be an option, that persistence and vigilance in cold case investigations can quite often break through walls which were once thought to be impenetrable. At the time of her disappearance, Mary Jane Vangilder was either 34 or 35 years of age. At the time, she was 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed approximately 165 pounds. She had brown eyes and hair that was described as either brown or auburn. According to her 201 file, she did not wear glasses and may have been in need of dental work for broken or decaying teeth. She was pronounced by a military medical examiner to be fit enough to handle work defined as arduous. Mary Jane was last known to have been living at one of 3 locations in north-central Ohio: 19 Sandusky Street, or number 2, now number 26 Truck Street in Plymouth, Ohio, or 311 Woodland Avenue in Willard, Ohio, approximately 7 miles to the north of Plymouth. From March 7, 1944 until March 8, 1945, Mary Jane was employed at the Shelby Army Air Force Depot, first as a storekeeper and later as a junior warehouseman. She requested release from her employment, citing added household duties as the reason. With regards to Mary Jane's activities prior to 1944, authorities would be very interested in identifying or learning about the persons and places listed as references and places of employment. As previous employments, she listed from February until April of 1942, waitress and clerk, employed by M.H. Mays of Route 3 in Fairmont, West Virginia. The name Meadowdale was written under the employee's name. From August of 1943 until February of 1944, waitress and clerk, employed by James Betts at 401 Adams Street in Fairmont, West Virginia. On a separate page, James Betts is listed as manager of the Sports Center at the same address. As personal references, Mary Jane listed Tom Ford, a retired railroad employee living at the Madison Hotel in Fairmont. A. Page King, a teacher also living in Fairmont. Fred Haskins, a laborer living at 401 and a half Adams Street in Fairmont. Joe Doringer, a tax collector in Fairmont. Her second employer, James Betts, is also listed as a reference. If you have any information concerning the disappearance of Mary Jane Vangilder, please contact Officer Adam Turner with the Shelby, Ohio Police Department at 419-347-2242.